Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about pairing beer with food. How do you make beer, first of all? It's the same process as making wine and cider. However, there are two ingredients that are added when you're making beer. So, the first ingredient is using water. And contrarily to wine or cider, you do not have to add juice. You do not have to add any acidity to your base. You could just use plain water. Tap water is fine as long as it's drinkable. And once you have this water, you can add sugar. So the sugar in the beer is going to be in form of malt, and you can use two different types of malt. It could either be liquid malt or it could be powdered malt. So these are called, in short term, it could be either dry malt extract or liquid malt extract. If you want to just accelerate the process and you don't want to have the grains, that's the quick option. If you want, you can use the extracts. However, if you want to do it as a traditional way, you can always use these grains. So you could first wet the grains, dry them, make sure that the sprouts are removed from the grains when they're wet, and you can use these grains and process them to make beer. This is a longer process by using these grains as malt, because instead of just putting the liquid malt or the dry malt extract inside your homebrew, you would have to make sure that the grains are ready to be used. They have to be wet and they have to be dried. Their sprouts have to be removed. So it's an extra step. However, you can also use the option of not using malt. So this is for anyone who is intolerant to, let's say, gluten. If you want to have gluten-free beer, instead of using malt, you can use sugar, because malt, what it does, it's used as food for the yeast. And sugar is also used as food for the yeast. So you can supplement the malt with sugar if you're gluten-free, and the yeast will be able to eat the sugar instead of the malt. So that's to make alcohol. However, how do you make that beer taste, that bitterness? If you want different types of beers, you'll have different types of flavors, but it all comes down to hops. So what are hops? Hops come from a plant, and hops, when it's used for beer, they come in little pellets they're usually green, little green pellets, and they're really bitter. So once you add them into your recipe, it's going to add bitterness to your home brew, and you have to boil it. So you have to use the liquid, so the water, the malt, or sugar. You have to boil this. You have to also boil it with the hops, and just this whole mixture together is going to make the base of your beer. And in order for it to have alcohol, because with those steps, it's just bitter liquid. So if you want to transform this bitter liquid to bitter liquid with alcohol, you have to add yeast. Usually what I use is EC1118 yeast to make wine or cider. However, there are beer yeast. And the beer yeast out there include Kveik yeast, that's a type of beer yeast. There are other type of yeast that you can use for beer. And if you want to make sure that the results are similar every time you make your homebrew, you can use a starter. And what this is you can put the yeast inside a little glass of water to hydrate it beforehand. And once this yeast is hydrated, then it'll already be ready. Once the yeast is ready to ferment, you could dip it inside your mixture of hops, sugar, or malt, and water. And the yeast is already activated. So once you put it in, it's already ready to work. If you do not have a starter, it doesn't matter. You can just put the yeast directly from the yeast package, it's a dry yeast. Once you add the yeast from the package to your jar, it could take sometimes hours or even a day for it to start fermenting. And since beer has a lower percentage, usually beer is roughly 4% alcohol to, let's say, 10% alcohol. So it takes less time to ferment than wine, because wine has a level of alcohol from 10 to 12%. And the higher percentage means that there's more sugar to ferment, and the beer has lower sugar to ferment. Therefore, there's lower percentage of alcohol in beer compared to wine. So going back to the beer taste, you have hops, you have the malt, and you can replace the malt with sugar. And once you have your beer, there are different types of beers out there. So you have the lagers, and the lagers include pale lager, for example, Pilsner. And how the lagers differ from other beers is that your yeast will be at the bottom, and that's how they ferment. So they'll be at the bottom of the jar, and that's how they continue throughout their fermentation. These lagers usually they taste dry. So they're less on the sweet side, they're more on the dry side, therefore less sugar is inside this type of alcohol. And it's more refreshing, it's lighter, and it's good for beginners. And there are different types of lagers. This includes, for example, Budweiser, Coors Light are a few examples of lagers. They have different colors, therefore we can't really specify that light colored beers are lagers because it varies. And the best food pairings would be tacos. You can pair lagers with tacos. You could pair them with pizza or let's say smoked fish. Then we're going to the ales. So the ales are typically a little bit stronger than the lagers. And this includes IPA, Belgian beer. And if ever you know anyone doing craft beer, this would be a good introduction to craft beer. Usually when it's craft, it's typically ales. So going back to the types of ales, if we're looking at IPAs, this is the one that's specifically focused on when people are doing craft beer. So they usually do IPAs. And if you're looking at Belgian beer, this one has a higher ABV or more alcohol. It's less bitter. And they have a sort of fruity, spicy, sweet flavor for Belgian beer. So contrarily to lagers, ales have their yeast floating at the top and lagers where their yeast floats at the bottom. So this is a difference in how they ferment. And lagers, they like fermenting at a colder temperature. However, ales, where the yeast float at the top, they like fermenting in room temperature. And the flavor for ales are varied. However, we can say that IPA is typically more bitter than other beers. We also have dark ales, and the darker ales are usually sweeter than the other types of ale. There's also something called wheat beer, and in this case, you have more foam on the top or on the head when it's a wheat beer. And the food pairings with ales are typically salad and grilled chicken, hamburgers, pecan pie. And pecan pie, it's mostly paired with dark, sweeter beers. So we had the lagers, we had the ales, and now we're going to talk about the stouts and porters. So stouts and porters are typically darker, and they're typically sweeter than the other beers. And two examples of these stout and porters are oatmeal stout and imperial stout. These are really dark beers. They're on the dark side. And if you have an oatmeal beer, oatmeal makes the beer thicker and it's more silky texture. And when you have imperial stout, this is more heavy and strong flavors. The best food to pair with these types of beers or these type of stouts and porters are, for example, for the oatmeal stout, it would be raw oysters. And for the imperial stout, it would be chocolate cake. And these type of beers, they're sweeter. And why are they sweeter? It's because there's a lot of unfermented sugar. Therefore, the yeast has not eaten all the sugar inside the jar, inside the fermentation jar. And these type of beer have this aftertaste of dark chocolate or coffee. And when you compare porters to stouts, so both of them are in the same category, but there's a slight difference. The porters taste a little bit less of coffee and a little bit more chocolate compared to the stouts. And now there are three basic principles when you want to match beer and food. So principle number one is that strong beers pair well with strong flavored foods. So once you have a strong beer, we're talking about a lot of bitterness or a lot of sweetness. It could be a lot of alcohol. It could be very rich. It could have a lot of roastiness. So all these characteristics are characteristics of strong beer. And when we're talking about strong flavored food, so it's food with a lot of fat, like fatty foods, or either very sweet, a lot of spices, or a lot of complexity. So if I had to take an example of a strong pairing would be IPA because it's really bitter, and the food could be pepperoni pizza, let's say, with strong meaty flavors. So that's number one. The first rule of pairing beer and food is that both of them have to match each other's intensity. So strong beers have to pair with strong foods. And the second one is that you have to find harmony. And by finding harmonies, this could be like food pairings. For example, the beer and the food must have common flavors or aromas. And let's say we take a beer that has sort of nutty tone and you pair this with cheese. So it's like pairing nuts and cheese. Another example would be pairing roasted flavored beers with chocolate. So it's like roasted and chocolate. Kind of reminds you of like marshmallow barbecue type So these flavors match well in terms. And another example is caramelized flavor beers matching with port. So this gives you like a sweet and salty harmony that goes together. That's for the second rule. It has to have harmonies. And the third rule of pairing beer and food is that you have to take into consideration sweetness, bitterness, carbonation, spices, and richness. So the goal is to find flavors that enhance each other. And this is a lot of trial and error. So you have to see what mixes well with what. And a few examples are that bitter beer balances sweet food. We also have that carbonation or that fizz that we add through carbonation drops balances umami. There's also sweet beers that balance spicy food, and bitterness in beer emphasizes spiciness as well. So if you have a bitter beer and you're eating something spicy, it's just going to make it more bold. And if you'd like to know different pairings on how to pair beer and food, you can book a class. The link is in the description below. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.